In this lesson, we'll learn how to use the levels adjustment here inside of Photoshop. Okay, great. So in the last lesson, we learned how to use the brightness contrast adjustment, and we saw how that gave us some limited control over just the overall level of contrast in an image, as well as the control over the overall brightness of the image. Now, the next step up from levels in terms of sort of the level of control that you have over the brightness values in your image is going to be the levels adjustment. But before we take a look at that, we need to jump over here inside our image and understand that this RGB image is made up of 3 different channels of data. So we have a red channel, a green channel, and a blue channel. Now, if we come over here in the channels panel, it's right here behind my layers panel, you'll see here that we have a representation of all 3 of those channels. Now, currently, this very top channel, this RGB channel, is a composite channel that combines all 3 of those, and that's what we're viewing right now. But we can actually come over here and select just the red channel, and we can see just the information on that red channel. You can see it comes across as grayscale, but that's because all we're dealing with is red. So really all we're needing is values from 0 to 1, or from pure black to pure white. So and that works for each one of these channels. So we have our red, our green, our blue, and again our composite channel. So if we come over here to our layers panel again, and let's go ahead and add a new adjustment for our levels. Now, again, like as before, we could come up here under image and adjustments, and we could find the levels adjustment here. But keep in mind that this is a destructive change in choosing this levels adjustment from this menu here. So rather than do that, we can either come down here again to this little half black, half white circle and find levels, or we can simply click on the levels adjustment right here in our adjustments panel. So let's go ahead and click on that here, and it's going to drop our adjustment layer and mask again on top of the background layer here, and it's going to open up our properties panel again, and this time the properties panel has quite a bit of information in it regarding this levels adjustment. Now we have the same buttons up here, control over the adjustment or control over the mask. So we'll make sure that that button on the left is selected. But what we have here in the very center of this properties panel is probably the most important thing. This is referred to as a histogram. So this is a representation of all of the red, green, and blue pixels in our image as it sits right now, ranging from the darkest pixels down here on the left to the very brightest pixels over here on the far right. Now, in terms of what we're looking at here being the RGB, or the composite of all 3 channels, we can actually set that right here with this little drop down menu. So you can see it says RGB right now, but we can actually come in here and specify whether we want to just work on the red channel, the green channel, or the blue channel. We'll go ahead and leave that as RGB right now, because what we're able to do here is, let's just kind of look at this image. Obviously, this image is divided sort of right down the middle, and we have some very, very dark pixels up here, and we have some very light pixels down here. So these dark pixels, for the most part, are going to be represented right in this area right here in my histogram. So I can see here that these are the closest pixels to black over here. So again, there's a lot of data that sits in the image right in this area. But this image has a lot of information, as we can see in the lower half, that is very, very bright. So if we look over here on our histogram, that information is going to be conveyed in this area right here. Now, sort of in this area in the center, this is going to be sort of your midtones, the area that's roughly halfway between black and white on the histogram. So now what we're able to do with the histogram and these little arrows underneath it is we can begin to shift the information. So let's say this is just too dark for us back here, and we want to really start to brighten that up. Well, I know that that data sits right in here for the most part, so we can start to grab this little black slider. And you can see here, by dragging it to the right, we're actually darkening those pixels. So what's happening here is, as we drag this to the right, Photoshop is taking all the pixels that fall to the left of that little arrow, and it's assuming those to be black. So this is a term that's referred to as clipping. So all of those pixels to the left of that arrow are now being clipped off. Well, that's not what we wanted to do. We wanted to brighten those areas up. So let's go ahead and take this and slide this back. Now, we could also do the same thing over here with our whites. So if we were to grab this little arrow and start to drag it to the left, you can see here what we're doing is we're starting to brighten this area up right here, but because there's such a clear separation of values in this image, in doing that, we're also starting to lose some detail in these rocks down here. Now, essentially, again, what we're doing is we're taking all of these pixels to the right of this arrow and clipping them. Only this time they're being clipped to white. So this arrow right here would represent our brightest values, our white pixels. So everything to the right of that is now being sort of rounded off to just a white. So let me go ahead and bring that back down, and you can see some of that detail start to come back in the rocks here. Now, in this particular example, a better option might be to adjust the midtones of this image. We could come in here and grab this little gray arrow right here and begin to shift it either direction. So you can see if I drag that to the left, what that's doing is it's adjusting where my 50% gray pixels lie in this histogram. So by dragging this to the left, it's assuming that location to be right here instead of over here where it used to be. So being that that's right here, it's now taking everything that was brighter than that 50%, and it's taking it and it's redistributing that between 50% and pure white. So the effect of that is that it's starting to brighten up some of these pixels. Now the range between that same location and pure black is now shorter. So there's fewer pixels that lie in this range right here now. You know, we could actually do this the exact opposite. We could actually take this and begin to drag that up. And again, you can see the exact opposite is happening in our image. Our darker areas, our shadows, are starting to grow and get even darker. That's because there's now more pixels that lie between that pure black and that 50% gray arrow right here. So you can also see there are numeric values underneath here that correspond to each one of those pixel points, or that pixel data in our histogram. So your kind of default settings here will be 0, 1, and 255. But if we begin to adjust these arrows, you'll notice that those values start to change. All right, great. Now, if we pan down here below the histogram, you're going to see this slider right here. And again, we have a black arrow and a white arrow on this. This is going to be your master control for the output levels. So in this case, we have our blacks. Let's say those are just too dark for us. We can actually come in here and limit how dark those blacks can be simply by dragging this black slider. And you can see here how dragging that up, let's say around 25 or so, is actually limiting where basically the darkest values can fall. So everything essentially beyond that arrow is now being ignored by Photoshop. And you know, if our image is just too bright, we could actually start to do the same thing on this side with the white arrow. And you can see here, if I start to drag that down, our whites are not allowed to get quite as bright because we're basically letting everything to the right of that arrow be ignored. All right, fantastic. So now, again, this is working on the composite. We're working right now on all three channels combined. But like I said before, we can actually come over here and adjust the individual channels. In this case, the red channel. So you can see here, if we were to maybe grab this black arrow on the red channel, we can actually start to reduce the amount of red in the image. So notice that the image is starting to turn sort of a bluish green color. Well, the reason for that is we're taking the red out of it, and thus the green and the blue channels are showing more information inside the image here. So, and then, you know, to contrast that, we can also come over here and begin to increase the amount of red in the image by dragging this white arrow right here. So, a lot of control right here inside the levels adjustment. As a matter of fact, there are some presets up here at the very top. If you drop this down, you can actually come in here and experiment with some of these if you'd like. And just like with the brightness and contrast adjustment, we also have an auto button here. So we could click on that and allow Photoshop to determine what the best distribution of our luminance values is going to be. So with that said, this is the levels adjustment here inside of Photoshop. This is actually a very, very powerful adjustment, and will probably take you just a little bit of time to get used to using it. But once you get the hang of it, you'll really have a lot of power right at your fingertips with levels. So with that said, Let's go ahead and move on to the next lesson, and we'll learn how to use the curves adjustment.